started. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. Welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Loren Working. I am from the University of York, and I will be presenting the event today. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome you on this story of adventure into shipwreck and onto an enchanted island. So today we're immersing ourselves in Shakespeare's Tempest through objects, looking at how objects from the Renaissance can help us piece together an understanding of the world of the play and of Shakespeare's own time. Part of the intention of my talk today is to think about how things like a ship or a book of magical spells can offer fresh ways into the play some 400 years after it was first printed. I also wanted to give you a little bit of an insider's perspective into my own journey as I was tasked to write a new introduction to the play recently. And in the words of one of my students, they said, oh, well, that's going to be hard because people have been writing about the Tempest for 400 years. What are you going to say about it that's actually new? So for a few weeks in the spring of 2022, I sat in the suite of an old 17th century house in Seville and tried to figure out what I thought about this play and what I could say about it. The general editor had asked me to consider it partly because my own research focuses on 16th and 17th century colonialism and travel. And so I had to decide whether I thought the play was an anti-colonial text or whether it was too rooted in the era of English expansion to really be a convincing commentary against English power. And so as of last month, the introduction and new edition of the play has just come out with Oxford World's Classics. So part of the talk today is kind of thinking about, how did I get from that blank Word document on my laptop and an old paperback edition of The Tempest to this new introduction, and why are shipwrecks so important to all of that? I'll let you have a very quick glance at this, but actually I think it's more fun if we kind of surprise you with the objects. So has anyone read The Tempest recently? Is it kind of fresh in your minds? Yeah, a few people. So I'm just going to give a super quick recap of the play for those who haven't had the chance to reread it recently. So The Tempest, as its own characters marvel, is a most strange story. It's both neatly self-contained and also really remarkably capacious. So it's one of Shakespeare's shortest plays, but it's also full of memories and dreams and illusions that kind of seem to collapse time in a lot of ways. The plot initially seems quite straightforward. Prospero is the exiled Duke of Milan, and he has spent the last 12 years on an isolated island, we don't know what the name of the island is, with his daughter Miranda, and two individuals who he holds in captivity. There's Caliban, who was born on the island, and Ariel, an airy spirit, who must do Prospero's bidding in the hopes of winning his freedom. Prospero mainly spends his time planning revenge against his scheming brother Antonio, who usurped his power and declared himself Duke of Milan those 12 years ago. And he finally gets the chance. So the play begins as Prospero, who is a kind of magician figure, relying on the help of books and charms, engineers the ideal conditions to enact his long-anticipated revenge and restoration as rightful ruler of Milan. Hearing that his brother Antonio is traveling across the Mediterranean, he uses his magical abilities to concoct the very storm that shipwrecks his brother onto the island. Antonio is shipwrecked along with Alonso, Duke of Naples, Alonso's son Ferdinand, and a host of other aristocrats and servants, including the butler Stefano and the jester Trinculo. So in the acts that follow, characters plot and scheme. Miranda falls in love with Ferdinand, the son of the Duke of Naples, who believes that his father has died in the wreck. And Caliban and Ariel yearn to escape Prospero's dominion. Prospero, when he's not orchestrating his daughter's marriage to Ferdinand, plays a series of tricks on his brother and his companions, and we'll look at some of those as we go along. And finally, at the end of the play, he reveals himself and, spoiler alert, gains recognition as rightful ruler of Milan. So he forgives his brother and prepares to return to Italy to resume his dukedom, while his daughter Miranda is promised to Ferdinand in marriage, thus cementing the political bonds of the Dukes of Milan and Naples. So the first object that I wanted to talk about is the ship itself. And really just start off with this moment that Shakespeare is writing in, this moment of significant advances in navigation. Developing trade networks led European merchants and sailors across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Shakespeare also wrote in the aftermath of the establishment of the first successful English colonies in the Americas, starting with Virginia in 1607. Colonial settlements on the islands of Bermuda in 1609 and Newfoundland in 1610 followed shortly after, so right in the years before The Tempest is first performed in 1611. And during this whole period, the English were also launching extended military campaigns in Ireland. And so a lot of the language that Prospero uses about his power reflects that of a lot of Jacobean politicians and mercenaries who are attempting colonial projects elsewhere. Many travel accounts of the time discuss the perils and terror of shipwreck. It was an era where travel involved immense risk. You left on a journey and there was no guarantee you'd come back. And we really get that in the opening scene of the play. And I won't read this whole thing out, but you get, from the very beginning, there's this big noise of thunder and lightning that's heard, and a lot of panic as various members of the crew are kind of running back and forth, and basically telling everyone to prepare themselves and to pray their final prayers because they're completely at the mercy of the sea. So Shakespeare opens the play by capturing that fear and desperation with that crack of thunder and the bright light. Was Shakespeare's account based on a specific shipwreck? Though only mentioned once in the play, Bermuda looms large in interpretations of The Tempest because of the possible influence of a pamphlet written by William Strachey called A True Reportory of the Wreck, which was Strachey's eyewitness account of a wreck of the Jamestown-bound Sea Venture, which was blown off course by a hurricane in 1609. After reaching the coast of Bermuda, which had been this uninhabited island hundreds of miles away from the North American mainland, the crew spent a year on the island before finding their way to Virginia. And it was really interesting to go back and look at Strachey's text, which is actually dedicated to a woman, which I think is a really cool fact that's not often emphasized. But the whole text is framed to a woman just known as Your Ladyship, so we don't actually know who she was. And it's this account for this woman where he writes about a most dreadful tempest assaulting the crew, who battled through it in amazement and fear. He praises merciful God for leading the crew safely to what the Spanish called the Devil's Islands, making this hideous and hated place both a place of our safety and the means of our deliverance. Upon reaching the island, Strachey found that Bermuda was not, as had been reputed, given over to devils and wicked spirits, but as commodious as most countries in the same climate. And so, even just from these quotes that I picked out, although it's a much longer document, you might get a sense of the themes and phrases that mean there's a possibility that Shakespeare had read a manuscript version of this account in order to kind of write The Tempest. Even this idea of the spirits that live on the island, like Ariel. But the shipwreck is also important for the rupture and disorientation it creates, which is the catalyst for all the action that follows. Although Prospero pieces the ship back together at the end of the play, there's value in the disruption that fragmentation causes. Reconciliation relies on the catalyst of the wreck. Fragmentation is embedded in the story from the beginning, as the mariner's cries pierce through the storm, "We split, we split, we split." And I think this notion of fragmentation is central to the play. I'll come back to this later. That splitting and that breaking and that sundering resists harmony. It allows broken objects to create different possibilities and outcomes than what would have happened if the ship had sailed back from Africa to Italy without being blown off course. So on to object 2, pocket, a pocket. Although I couldn't resist but putting 2 pockets here because there are different characters on the island, so they may have had different pockets with them. And these are kind of fabulous in their own ways. They're both from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And this is connected to one of my favorite lines in the play. So the wise counselor, Gonzalo, a faithful associate of Prospero's who had furnished him with objects for survival when he was exiled, gets shipwrecked on the island. And he's optimistic about his surroundings. He sees in the natural environment of the island the potential for a classical golden age, a place where everyone lives in harmony and simplicity, taking only what they need from the land. There won't be riches or poverty, he says, no occupation, but men idle all, and women too, innocent and pure. But Sebastian, their companion, is a bit more cynical, and he makes fun of Gonzalo's enthusiasm for their new environment. I think he will carry this island home in his pocket and give it to his son for an apple, he says. And for me, this short exchange really highlights one of the fundamental ideas in Renaissance voyages, of what they called voyages of discovery, which is the impulse to possess. The idea that when you come to a new place and it seems uninhabited, never mind that Caliban already lives there, it's normal to want to own it, to treat entire ecosystems, or indeed the whole world, as a thing you just take for yourself, and you stuff it in your pocket and you take it home with you. And in some ways we're kind of living with the effects of that capitalist mentality even today. We can't talk about The Tempest without talking about Prospero's books either. I'm really fascinated by this image of the book here, that kind of crinkly object that you see, which was actually found in a 400-year-old shipwreck. And this book, which is actually stamped with the Royal Stuart coat of arms, even though it was a Dutch ship, kind of made me think of Prospero's books, which are so important to the character and his sense of power. So Prospero is a bit of a self-professed bookworm. He admits that even before he was exiled, he became too absorbed in his books and ceased to devote himself to the political service required of a Renaissance politician. He says, "My library was dukedom large enough." His magical cloak, which he carries kind of throughout the play, and his books are critical to his ability to practice magic and engender the conditions for his political restoration. Watching Miranda and Ferdinand's courtship, he congratulates himself on manufacturing their encounters and returns to my book to perform much business appertaining. Caliban, who sees himself as the rightful owner of the island through his mother Sycorax, recognizes the significance of Prospero's books, stressing to Trinculo that his overthrow will only be possible having first seized his books. To resist Prospero, Caliban stresses that they must first possess his books, for without them he has not one spirit to command. And when he prepares to abjure his magic at the end, Prospero recognizes the need to distance himself from his physical objects. He says, "I'll drown my book." So to Jacobean audiences, Prospero's deep love of books might have evoked the wonders and pleasures of elite libraries, like the one I've shown on the slide here, which is the Morley Library in Winchester Cathedral, which also has these celestial and terrestrial globes, like Renaissance libraries often did. And these were full of travel stories, alchemical studies, classical tales, political philosophy. Educated women and men in Shakespeare's time widely read and collected books and associated ephemera on printed pages with kind of reading and gaining new knowledge as well, so pamphlets and woodcuts and maps. The knowledge contained on pieces of paper could be bound together, cut up, reassembled, even carried on ships. I think it's really significant that we find them at the bottom of the sea, and we find them in colonial sites where early colonists who only have so much space to carry things with them want to carry books. So books such as this one and the marine archaeology of other shipwrecked sites have brought book covers and book clasps to the surface, giving us a sense that travelers willingly crossed oceans with their books. Though the titles and authors of his volumes remain unnamed, their value to Prospero is clear. Books offer him knowledge and a means of entering into dialogue with other authors, connecting him to different places and even to his own past. And I think there's something even in just really enjoying the materiality of a book at a time when everything has become so digital. So what is Prospero actually using his magic books for, and what do they look like? I have one example here, which is just like one of the creepiest books I've come across from this period. It's at the Newberry Library. It's a book of magical charms, believed to be kind of authored and put together, compiled by Robert Ashley, who was a lawyer at the Middle Temple in London in the early 17th century. When thinking about Prospero's magical abilities, and also the way he sought to frame his own power in contrast to that of Caliban's deceased mother Sycorax, whom he calls a witch, I found it useful to revisit this cryptic book of magical charms currently held, as I mentioned, at the Newberry in Chicago. It's this mysterious occult book, basically written at the time of the Tempest, And the book includes all kinds of experiments based on tests and trials and pre-existing advice books and philosophical treatises. There are experiments pertaining to love, how to learn the sex of a baby while it's still in the womb, Latin incantations, prayers, health remedies, and notes on how to talk to spirits. And that's one of the images I included on the right. You might just be able to make out at the top of the page, it says to speak with spirits, and then there's the kind of notes on how to do that. I have not tried. Throughout the play, Prospero relishes the practice of magic and views spectacle as essential to his designs, forcing characters to undergo tests and trials to bring about their contrition. At the same time, conscious that the North African Sycorax was exiled for her magical abilities, Prospero continually seeks to distinguish himself from her forms of power, determined to show that his art, as he frequently calls it, emerges from diligent study and controlled manipulation. 17th century playgoers would have recognized the tensions in Prospero's engagement with the supernatural, which operated as a source of power while revealing his potentially dangerous attraction to forbidden knowledge. This is the aftermath of Henry VIII's break with Rome and the spread of English Protestantism, when religious authorities were deeply concerned with the boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy. And King James himself had written a treatise against witchcraft and sorcery, denouncing witches or enchanters as slaves of the devil. And in some ways, Prospero seems anxious about this. His anxieties over his magical abilities directly relate to how he presents Caliban's mother as a foul witch and a damned witch, banished for mischiefs manifold and sorceries terrible. Although Prospero forces Ariel into his service, just as Sycorax did, he sets himself up as a liberator. And yet, despite the lengths to which he goes to degrade Sycorax's abilities and legitimize his own, Shakespeare confounds the division between legitimate and illegitimate magic in the final act in a really clever way. Where Prospero seems to renounce his magic, he says, "This rough magic I here abjure," and promises to break my staff and drown my book. But on the other hand, one of his powerful incantations towards the end of the play in Act 5 is actually an almost word-for-word speech taken from Medea's speech in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So his power is not really that benign. Prospero seems to acknowledge this when he understands the need to violently distance himself from his magical objects, including his staff, in order to return to Italian society and resume his dukedom. Okay, so on to a piece of silver. Something I thought a lot about when I wrote my introduction was about wonder and astonishment and curiosity, because this really suffuses the play. The word strange and the word wonder come up again and again and again. And even though she professes to be no wonder or nothing special, Miranda's own name is a form of the Latin verb miror, meaning to wonder. Early modern writers often use the language of wonder to convey a sense of the marvelous or unexpected. But in the characters of Trinculo and Stefano, we also see how wonder was becoming increasingly commodified in the Renaissance. It was not enough to behold a wonder, as one might do in the Middle Ages. One needed to possess it. It wasn't just an act of God, it was something you wanted to kind of capitalize on in some way. Cheap pamphlets printed in London sold tales of monstrous births and rare natural phenomena such as comets, and advertised curiosities on display for public consumption. It's this commercialization of wonder that helps explain Trinculo's famous reaction to beholding Caliban for the first time. No, I didn't include it. So he kind of famously says, "What have we here, a man or a fish, a strange fish? Were I in England now as once I was, and had but this fish painted, not a holiday fool there would give me a piece of silver. There would this monster make a man. Any strange beast there makes a man. When they will not give a doit to relieve a lame beggar, they will lay out 10 to see a dead Indian." So the jester immediately sees Caliban as something strange and not quite categorizable. He mentions a doit, which is a coin, and a piece of silver. To have this strange fish on a sign would entice visitors to pay to see the unusual and would make a man, or that is, enrich the savvy entrepreneur. But I wanted to pick up on the coin as an object to consider its own origins, likely in the highlands of South America. In the early 17th century, much of the silver circulating in Europe came from the mountain of Potosi in what is now Bolivia, but was then part of the Spanish Viceroyalty of Peru. Pieces of 8 forged in those notorious silver mines became a global currency, or they were melted and reminted into different coins in the Royal Mint in the Tower of London. And I think it's actually in 1613, so just a few years after Shakespeare wrote The Tempest, that James I issued a proclamation actually complaining that there was too much of these pieces of 8 coming from the Americas and being kind of reminted and circulated in London. Stories circulated in England of wedges of silver stacked high on mules and horses, and merchant storehouses in Nicaragua raided by Francis Drake. The allure of South American silver loomed large in the mind of colonial promoters for decades. And in 1613 as well, one geographer wrote of how Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, had traversed the world round and returned a golden hind indeed, with her belly full of gold and silver. So what does all this have to do with Caliban? Well, a lot has been made of this mention by Trinculo of how city dwellers wouldn't part with a coin to relieve a beggar, but they would lay out 10 to see a dead Indian. It's a little unclear here whether Indian refers to an individual from Asia or the Americas, although there were quite a few Algonquins from North America who were being displayed for a wonder at this exact time, in the words of other Londoners. So, is that a reference to someone like Epineau, for example, a Wampanoag man who eventually returns to New England? But even in the small mention of a piece of silver and the display of foreign bodies, we get a stark glimpse into a whole world of global circulations that would have informed how audiences thought about the play and about Caliban. And the context of colonialism and of displaying, the idea that the Indian who's on display is dead is also, I think, really jarring. Thinking about people's willingness to see kind of bodies almost from this medical perspective. And a really haunting reminder that even if the play isn't about America per se, the objects and language in it orient us towards these vast flows of migration, exploitation, and extraction, and to this whole economy of encounters. While Trinculo and Stefano dream of turning Caliban into a commodity that will enrich them with pieces of silver, the band of gentlemen plot their own schemes and become enticed by the promise of an extravagant feast. It appears to be a figment of their imaginations, but it's real in the sense that Prospero uses his spells to create the illusion with Ariel's help. Ariel's orchestration of the vanishing banquet in Act 3, Scene 3, which is kind of right in the middle of the play, is one of his greatest feats of wonder, providing the set piece for an important turning point in the drama. The stage directions describe several strange shapes that bring a banquet and dance about it with gentle actions of salutations, and inviting the king and his companions to eat, they depart. The gentlemen all react with various expressions of wonder. Alonso sees harmony in the graceful dancing. Gonzalo is delighted by the marvelous sweet music of this multi-sensory experience. Sebastian is a bit more dismissive. He says the display is about as fantastical as a unicorn and about as real. Renaissance poetry and plays, from tantalizing tales and classical epics to Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus from 1592, included tales of exotic fruits gathered together to please and to tempt. In these instances, as Frank Kermode put it, abundant displays of food and illusory banquets represent the voluptuous attractions of sense which the resolved soul must resist. And I couldn't resist thinking about this material through the still life genre that was becoming popular at the time of Shakespeare's writing. Many of you have probably seen these before. The York Art Gallery has a couple in their collections from the 17th century. They sometimes are a bit easy to kind of just walk past when you're in a big gallery full of military commanders on horseback and other kind of beautiful artworks. But I think they're really, really interesting. An artist visually rendered these tensions between fruitfulness and decay, desire and temperance in these paintings, with these abandoned banquets glistening in the shadows. So there's always something a little bit eerie about the way that this food is displayed, it kind of seems to have been nibbled on or eaten a bit, as if all of a sudden its banqueters and feasters have just kind of vanished into thin air. Oysters and brittle clay pipes, luminescent bubbles and plump fruits on the edge of rotting enticed viewers, but also reminded them of their own transience. Homo bula, man is a bubble. We're all apt to kind of pop at any moment. While elements of the banquet are recognizable to the gentleman, an eerie dislocation like the atmosphere of the still life pervades the scene. When the shapes disappear at Prospero's command, one of the characters, Francisco, is uneasy at how they vanished strangely. Ariel then enters like a harpy amidst thunder and lightning, clapping his wings on the table, and the banquet vanishes, kind of echoing Virgil's Aeneid, where a banquet also evaporates when a fury touches the table. Harpies were monstrous female figures who acted as agents of retribution, sent by the gods to bring judgment on the guilty. Ariel sets in motion the rest of the action of the play when he reveals my business to you, that you three, Antonio and his companions Sebastian and Alonso, from Milan did supplant good Prospero. So as the gentlemen come to terms with this news, Ariel vanishes dramatically, leaving the men to contemplate their own helplessness at the hands of Prospero, and realizing he has been moving the action since their arrival. And I think it gives directors a lot of fun when they're staging the scene as well, because you have to figure out how to orchestrate a vanishing object from the scene, from the stage. So as we've seen, the Tempest is all about magic and illusion. Prospero charms a ship, causes a shipwreck, sends different members of the aristocracy to different parts of the island to ensure that Miranda and Ferdinand fall in love, and Antonio learns to become penitent. Illusory banquets tempt and tease the corrupt aristocrats. At one point, spirits appearing as hounds chase Caliban and his drunken companions around the stage. But clothing is important to how Shakespeare plays with reality and appearance, and to how characters try to make sense of the bewildering atmosphere of the island. Early on, Gonzalo realizes the island is not what it seems when he notices its effect on his clothes following their shipwreck. Our garments, being as they were drenched in the sea, hold notwithstanding their freshness and gloss, being rather new-dyed than stained with salt water. The play contains lots of references to clothing and their role in conveying power, taste, and identity. On one hand, garments are intimate objects, worn close to the body and sometimes considered to be extensions of a person. When the time comes for Prospero to reclaim his dukedom, he puts on his old hat and his rapier, and he says, "I will myself present as I was sometime in Milan." On the other hand, clothing could be refashioned and resold, so the garments were not a straightforward reflection of a person's inner self. Trinculo refers to a frippery, a place that sold second-hand clothing, in order to differentiate the rich clothing that he sees hanging to tempt him from unwanted apparel. By contrast, Stefano and Trinculo are drawn to the glistering apparel they come across in Act 4, Scene 1. To them, the mysterious clothing hanging on the line signifies social currency. The clothes that Ariel has laid out to tempt the bedraggled conspirators lead them to assume lordly airs as they pile them on. Caliban, however, is cautious. He calls the garments trash and views them as a distraction, as obstacles that will allow Prospero more time to learn of their plot against him. And this image of the gown that I have on display is one of the objects found in the same wreck as the book. So really amazing that the fabric kind of survived under the ocean, in part because it was under the ocean and the particular kind of conditions that it was in. But even then, even with all that kind of damage, you can still get a sense of the kind of fiery colors of the brocade. Caliban's rejection of European finery can be related to his ability to dream of possibilities outside of colonial power. In the 20th century, writers from historically invaded and colonized countries, ranging from parts of Africa to the Caribbean, began to imaginatively adopt Caliban as a kind of ancestor who would offer a rallying cry against Western imperialism, really building on Caliban's famous words where he says, "This island's mine, by Shipwrecks, my mother." His most graceful lines in the play are about knowing all the qualities of the isle, of understanding his environment and living in a way that contrasted to the beliefs and values of the Europeans. While other characters are mistrustful or afraid of the strange noises of the island, Caliban relishes these sounds. "Be not afraid," he says. "The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not." And these are words that were actually used, you might remember, in the London Olympics. I think it was Ray Fiennes opened the Olympics by reading this. So kind of interesting, because Caliban, this isn't a reference to England or the British Isles. It's this kind of mysterious no place. When Caliban cries to dream again, he seeks to experience the world in a way that is very different from the aristocratic pageantry around him with all that glistering apparel. So on to the pearls and coral in Ariel's song. There's a lot of music in The Tempest. And Ariel, as a character, like Caliban, seems to want something different to the others on the island. Caliban's "This isle is full of noises" is one of the most famous speeches of the play, but another extract that has really captivated writers and thinkers for centuries is Ariel's song, where he says he's singing this to Ferdinand after Ferdinand believes that his father has drowned in the shipwreck. And he says, "Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell." And it's inspired many writers since. So Percy Shelley's Gravestone in Rome includes some lines from this. That sea change into something rich and strange. T.S. Eliot picks up a line or two of it in The Wasteland. It's mentioned in works by James Joyce, Joan Didion, the St. Lucian poet Derek Walcott as well. And alongside Ariel's song, I wanted to include this sea sculpture, which you can hopefully see on the slide, from the Victoria and Albert Museum. There's a better view of it. These shipwrecked objects embody how new forms can emerge from broken or lost objects. They were created from disaster, following the wreck of a ship to the Dutch East Indies. So this is the V&A calls it a sea sculpture, I think, which is kind of fancy artistic talk for a bunch of rubbish that fused together in an interesting way. It's from the early 18th century, and I found this gnarled shipwrecked object really helpful in thinking about Ariel's somber, haunting song, which he sings, as I mentioned, to Ferdinand. He's kind of telling Ferdinand, that his father has become a new thing. He's melding with the sea. His bones are becoming coral. He's undergoing a change into something new and altogether different, but he isn't just disappearing. He's not just being carried away by the tide. So these objects were in this ship that was wrecked off the coast of Vietnam and then started fusing with those barnacles. And it seems to me that The Tempest is all about these kind of dissolving boundaries and new formations and possibilities that kind of take their place and also belong in museums. So Object 9, we're getting there. Object 9 is a mask costume. Masks were these elaborate multimedia affairs that involved opulent costuming, music, and dance, often performed at the royal court, where the king and queen themselves played parts in the drama, scripted for them by famous poets and playwrights. Surviving mask costumes, such as this one, show how members of the court were transformed into fairy princes and glittering water gods. And The Tempest, despite being such a short play, even manages to incorporate a play within a play. Audiences get the main story, but they also get a little mask inserted inside, even though Prospero does interrupt it at the end, which we'll get to. Masks were often staged to celebrate high-ranking marriages, And the Tempest was performed at court in 1613 for the festivities around James I's daughter Elizabeth and her marriage to Frederick of Bohemia. So if you've seen a performance of the play, you might have noticed that the masque adds an additional element of fantasy and fun. Suddenly, the stage is filled with jaunty harvesters in straw hats celebrating spring, and goddesses, including Iris, goddess of the rainbow, there to initiate Miranda into the world of love and prosperity. But there's a more cynical way of looking at it too. The masque comes after Prospero has told Ferdinand that Miranda is my gift, one he confers along with a threat, that if Ferdinand consolidates his love for Miranda before they're officially married through holy rite, this contract will lead to barren hate. The language of contract implies a legal transaction, and there's a dynastic concern that underpins his warning to Ferdinand. Much depends on this contract, since Prospero's own power will largely be restored by creating a royal alliance between Milan and Naples through his daughter's union with Alonso's heir. Miranda seems very much in love, and very well may be. But Ferdinand, though he does seem like a virtuous and fitting companion, is one of the few men she's ever met. Having lived on the island for most of her life with only her father, Caliban, and Ariel as company, she absorbs the language of economic exchange that often accompany discourses of marriage and female chastity. She refers to her modesty as the jewel in my dower, and the masque further serves to embellish the reality of her own loss of agency through marriage. But I think the costume here also kind of reminds us of that murkiness, or that two-way influence between life and art, of the theatrical nature of all kinds of ceremonies that mark our lives, like marriage. Apparel, wrote one 17th century traveler, is like a masking suit, wherein we act not what we are, but what we seem to be. And finally, we get to the great globe itself. During the masque, Prospero remembers the threat posed by Caliban, who's wanted to overthrow him and regain control of the island, and he brings the performance to an abrupt end. Ariel brings Caliban, Stefano, and Trinculo before Prospero, who shows them he has known about their plotting all along and chases them off with some spirits and curses. As he dissolves the masque, Prospero relies on evoking stuff to express his disenchantment. He suddenly becomes melancholy. Aware that his years of scheming are approaching a conclusion, he calls life an insubstantial pageant faded, leaving no material trace behind. All things, he said, towers, palaces, and the great globe itself will crumble and fade. Our revels now are ended, he announces. The cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself shall dissolve like a mask. In the great globe itself, we come back in some sense to the pocket, and to the idea that globes both represent something vast, the earth itself, and something that can be conceptualized and understood through scale, understood through its thingness and its portability, such as these really beautiful celestial globes that were popular in the 16th century and often kind of put on in libraries or on display tables, in banquets, and had the most beautiful detailing and engraving. So ultimately, I came to see that The Tempest is both a play about travel and this budding colonial moment, but also one that suggests a different way to live. On one hand, a bunch of Europeans arrive on an unnamed island and quickly fantasize about settling there. The sole inhabitant is not some shipwrecked European, but a man, described as strange and deformed, who is born of an African woman. Characters speak of owning and possessing the island, fantasies of dominion that enthrall the kings and the kind of aristocratic characters, but also the servants themselves, who quickly kind of establish their own hierarchies on the island. But it's also possible to see a critique of colonial acquisition at the heart of the play. Caliban is critical of the trash and luggage that Prospero has carried with him. The Europeans relinquish their claims over the island in the end, so they actually get back on their ship and leave. For the indigenous Mohegan director and playwright Madeline Sayet, the ending of The Tempest contains the potentially radical fantasy of anti-colonialism. What would happen, Sayet wondered, in this really interesting performance she did at the Globe in 2021 called Where We Belong, where she kind of linked her own experience of coming to London to get a PhD in Shakespeare. So she's kind of specifically thinking about the Tempest, and she said, what would it mean if, as he moved towards freedom, Caliban's language came back too, replacing that of his oppressor? If Ariel, an airy spirit, too was of here, was blackbirds like me, a flock of blackbirds everywhere and nowhere at once. In this reading of the play, acts of unsettling enable different relationships between people, ancestors, and landscapes. In the epilogue, Shakespeare calls on audiences to judge and respond to the story he's presented to us. Prospero engages with us directly, asking us to confine him or release him as we wish. Without his magic, which he's abjured, he's become powerless to manipulate. The magic, though, is not gone but transferred. We are left with the power, for good or ill, to become manipulators and enchanters. So in the end, Shakespeare's shipwreck, here and elsewhere, are catalysts. They bring disaster, but also, like the shipwrecked porcelain fusing with barnacles, like Ariel's song, the fragments of the wreck signal new formations or new ways to live. Shakespeare's shipwrecks, like enchantment itself, shows us that we are not always bound by the rules of the world, by how things are. Disaster and renewal are separated by nothing but a splinter. Thank you. So I think we've got a few minutes for questions, and I don't have a chair for this panel, so I'll just kind of hover around, but I think we've got a roving mic as well.
Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. Just the question I'd like to put to you, if possible, is there have been some wonderful film adaptations of The Tempest. And I mean, a traditional one is the BBC Shakespeare version. Another one I can think of, which is much different, is Peter Greenaway's Prospero's books.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to ask you if you have a favourite of any kind that you can recommend?
Thank you for that question. That's lovely. And I wonder if we could maybe crowdsource, because other people who are kind of better versed in performance history might have others. I have to admit, I kind of stayed away from watching adaptations when I was writing it, because the kind of historian in me was like, oh, I want to kind of stick to the early modern context. So the only one that I watched and cheated a little was Prospero's books, because I think that one's really marvelous. If others aren't familiar with it, it's from 1991, I think. Yeah. And the bit about kind of thinking about Prospero's books, I was really, I guess enchanted is the right word, of it seems like you're quite familiar with it, but yeah, the kind of transposition of kind of materials and the kind of swirl and performance of the mask and the experience of the shipwreck, I think all worked really well. Yeah. Does anyone else have a favorite Tempest performance that they've seen, or an adaptation in any way? I do kind of recommend Madeline Sayet's Where We Belong, because even though it's kind of about her own experience as an Indigenous person in the UK, The Tempest is one of the main texts that she kind of plays with in that. Anything else? Yeah, it seems like we've all got some homework. Yeah.
Which was the one with the sailors in the mask? Anybody remember that one?
Oh, no.
I can't remember the name of the director or the.
There's, yeah, I don't know. There's a recent. I might get this totally wrong, but is it with like Tilda Swinton or something? I think there's like a kind of swapping, a gender swap one where Prospero is a woman.
Yeah,
Helen Mirren. Oh, Helen Mirren. There we go. Yeah, so there's that one from, I guess maybe that's kind of 10 years ago now or something like that. But yeah, it's kind of interesting.
So was the South African performance as well, which very much focused on the apartheid aspect of colonialism.
Yes.
Which is very colourful as well.
Is that the Anthony Sher one?
Yeah.
Leeds, yes.
I think it's the films are intriguing, but the kind of stage history of the performing of The Tempest is, it's so vast, and I think a lot of that kind of playing with the post-colonial elements are really intriguing, and nice to see specific places around the world having really specific responses to what that might mean. Yeah.
Very interesting to hear what you were saying. Beautiful speech, beautiful session, in fact. Interesting about the colonialism, and I do wonder if we have to go as far as somewhere like Bermuda, possibly, and considering what happened when James I came into being as being James VI of Scotland, if the colonialism that possibly could be inferred is more of the Scots and the English joining. The magical book sort of reminded me very much of druidic sort of symbolism and runes and stuff such as that.
Yeah.
So is it more a, the boogeymen are coming in from beyond the border and stuff, rather than the outside influence of the Americas and stuff?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, loads of plays from the period put in a lot of sneaky little barbs against the Scots. The playwrights get imprisoned for it, and there are kind of masks even, going back to the idea of the mask, where just really racist, where there's just kind of like imitating Irish accents or Scottish accents in plays. So the Jacobean stage is definitely a place where that happens. I think that's really intriguing. I think the whole idea of the island and what the island means, and the kind of to take a phrase by a scholar who wrote a whole book on this, but the kind of island thinking that proliferates in this period, where the island just becomes this really handy way of almost taking an abstract idea of another place and using it to kind of get that mirror back onto the realm itself is really important. I'm trying to think if I can find any other little tidbits or kind of language in the play that might suggest Scotland particularly, and nothing comes to mind. And I agree with you. I think that's probably an element that's also there. For a long time, the Tempest was seen as kind of a play about the Americas, and there's certainly a lot of scholarship now that pushes back against that and is kind of thinking more in terms of what does colonialism mean to the English in this period, because it's so wide-ranging and it's happening across the Atlantic, but it's also happening much, much closer to home. Yeah.
I'm guessing there was an 11th object that didn't make the final cut. What was it?
Ooh, thank you. Oh gosh, I wish I had my list now. Let me think. I don't know. What would people have liked to see? What did I leave out? I was tempted to bring in specific books rather than just a shipwreck book, for example, and do a little bit more about the textual influence. Even look at something like Michel de Montaigne's really famous essays that are circulating in England at the time. And one of his essays where he talks about Brazil seems to be quite an important influence on the character of Gonzalo, for example. So I think bringing out a little bit more of those connections between Shakespeare's time and his characters would have been fun.
Sort of piggybacking off that, I suppose, I remember quite clearly being told when I was at school by an English teacher that there was a shipwreck that was widely reported at the time of when Shakespeare was about to write Tempest, which the teacher gave me to understand inspired him to do it in the first place, that there was this shipwreck that Shakespeare thought, I wonder if someone had engineered that, had caused that, who would that be, why would they do it, and that's why he wrote the play. Were there any famous or sort of notorious specific shipwrecks from around that time, or is it just sort of what you mentioned at the start, the general risk of travelling by sea that came to give the idea for Tempest potentially?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's a really fun book that's come out just in the last year or so from Oxford University Press about a book called Shipwrecks in the Sea, which is exactly about just how many shipwrecks actually occurred very close to, all kinds of shorelines across the British Isles. And again, it kind of goes back to that earlier point of the Atlantic and kind of global travel being a really important influence, but also that there are these shipwrecks that many English people could have seen if they'd just been kind of on the shore. There's these really harrowing and I'm not going to know the exact name of the ship, but there's a few accounts from around the time that Shakespeare's writing The Tempest of the really bad weather that the English are getting. And one of the things I kind of look at in my introduction as well is kind of like thinking about the environment and climate change and how we can kind of see some of those aspects in the play. And these pamphlets, I think they're 1610, 1611, so again, same time as this, mention these really harrowing accounts of dead women and men on like planks who just float onto the shores of England as a result of this tempestuous weather. So I think I don't know if there's a specific ship that caused a big sensation that Shakespeare was maybe trying to unravel. But I think certainly that experience of being this island nation surrounded by the sea, and that being such a kind of everyday part of a lot of people's lives who live in kind of regions outside of London especially, must have, come into his thinking as well.
One thing that I found particularly interesting in your lecture was the reference to Medea's speech of his Metamorphoses.
Yeah.
And I just find the references in The Tempest from the classical references that Shakespeare used in The Tempest just fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a powerful piece of literature.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And to put that in Prospero's, that he doesn't use that for Sycorax. He uses it for Prospero.
Yeah.
He kind of makes Prospero ventriloquize the words of this powerful classical witch. It is kind of unexpected, and it's quite a lengthy speech as well. It's not a brief reference. It's, I don't know, like 15, 20 lines or something, and he mentions even kind of raising people from the dead and things. So it's all of a sudden, again, you're like, oh, if this is actually something Prospero's been doing with his magic, it's a lot kind of darker than we expect. And I think it's such a clever way of immediately complicating Prospero's own narrative that he's been telling us. That his art is legitimate and that this kind of North African woman is completely delegitimate. In terms of kind of intertextuality, and that's some of the other sources I wanted to bring out as well. I mean, a lot has been done on the influence of the Bermuda pamphlet, as I mentioned, but it seems pretty clear that Shakespeare must have also consulted Richard Eden's 1577 History of Travail, which is an account of Magellan's travels around kind of South America, because that is where the term Setibos comes from, which is the god that Sycorax apparently worships, and she's mentioned twice in the play. And that kind of reference to a Patagonian god from South America is found in this account in Richard Eden. So there's lots of really kind of clever ways that Shakespeare gives us little eggs to find and to uncover classical and kind of contemporary.
And finally, you did refer to Virgil's Aeneid. Does Shakespeare use much of Virgil's Aeneid in your view?
I mean, yes, he does. Not as much as maybe some of the other writers that we might imagine, like Ben Jonson, who had this like really, really deep love of very closely marrying kind of classical forms and styles. Shakespeare doesn't do it on quite the same level, but just by nature of his education in this time period, he would have had kind of Virgil beaten into him, and he does kind of weave in certain stories and some of the kind of language of his epics as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I think we'll wrap up there, but have a lovely afternoon, and thank you for spending your Saturday with me.